What surprised her wasn't the silence, it was how much she didn't want it to end. The third meeting was the one she almost canceled. Elizabeth Vaughn stared at her phone in the back seat of a black sedan idling outside her office tower on West 57th Street. Manhattan stretching around her in sharp glass lines and restless motion. Her calendar stacked in 15-minute blocks, her assistant texting twice in under a minute, her board waiting 3 floors up, and yet her thumb hovered over the screen longer than it should have, longer than logic allowed. Because this ride, this simple, routine ride, had quietly become the one part of her day that didn't ask anything from her. The first time had meant nothing. Just another driver, another trip across the city, another transaction measured in miles and minutes. He had opened the door without a word, his movements steady, unhurried, like he wasn't performing for anyone. Daniel Carter. The name had flashed briefly on her screen before she dismissed it, already halfway into a call about a merger that would decide the next quarter. She remembered the way he adjusted the rearview mirror, not to look at her, but away, giving her space without making it obvious. She remembered the temperature inside the car, cool but not cold, the kind of detail no one ever got right. And the music, low, almost non-existent, just enough to soften the edges of the city noise without intruding. She hadn't said thank you when she got out. She rarely did. The second time hadn't been planned either. Same driver, same quiet, same sense that something had been anticipated. Her preferred route already set. Traffic avoided without explanation. A bottle of water placed within reach, but never offered out loud. It was precise, thoughtful, invisible, and that was what unsettled her. Because nothing in her world was invisible. Everything came with intent, with leverage, with expectation. But this felt different. Daniel never asked questions, never filled the silence. He drove like the space between them mattered. And somehow, that space felt safe. Now, on the third ride, Elizabeth exhaled slowly, the kind of breath she didn't realize she'd been holding all morning. Outside, horns layered over sirens, footsteps rushed across crosswalks, the city pulling everyone forward whether they were ready or not. Inside the car, it was still. Not empty, just still. She glanced up briefly. Daniel's hands rested steady on the wheel, one at 10, one at 2, eyes forward, posture relaxed but attentive, like he was fully there without needing to prove it. No sudden movements, no unnecessary words, just presence. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't check it. That was new. Minutes passed, or maybe seconds. Time felt different in here. Slower, softer. She leaned back slightly, heels off by an inch, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough to notice. The car turned onto Park Avenue, sunlight catching the edges of passing buildings, flickering across the window like something trying to get her attention. She didn't move. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't planning her next sentence, her next decision, her next defense. She was just there, and she hated how much she needed that. Hated it because it didn't make sense. Because it came from a place she had trained herself not to depend on. A driver, a stranger, a man who didn't ask for anything. The car slowed at a red light. Daniel reached forward slightly, lowering the volume of the already quiet music, not looking back, not explaining, just noticing. Elizabeth watched the movement in the reflection of the glass. Small, precise, intentional. She swallowed, something unfamiliar settling in her chest. Not heavy, not sharp, just present. The light turned green. The car moved again. And for reasons she couldn't explain, not yet, she didn't want the ride to end. By the time the car eased to a stop along the curb on Madison Avenue, Elizabeth already knew she was going to break her own rule. She did not linger. Not in meetings, not in conversations, and certainly not in cars driven by people she did not know. But when the engine idled and the city noise began to seep back in through the glass, she did not reach for the door handle right away. She sat there, her fingers resting loosely on her phone, her reflection faint in the tinted window. Daniel did not turn around. He did not clear his throat or ask if she needed anything else. He simply waited, the same way he had driven, steady and unintrusive, as if time inside the car belonged to her and not to the ticking meter. A few seconds passed, or maybe longer. Elizabeth finally moved, pushing the door open, the sharp edge of Manhattan rushing back in like a tide. She stepped out, heels meeting pavement with quiet precision, and for a brief moment she considered saying something. Thank you, or even just a nod. But the words felt heavier than they should have, caught somewhere between habit and something she had not practiced in a long time. So she closed the door instead, gently, and walked toward the building in trance without looking back. Inside, everything resumed its usual pace. Voices overlapped. Screens glowed. Decisions stacked on top of decisions. By noon, she had already dismissed 2 proposals and approved 3 others, her tone crisp, her posture exact, every movement controlled. No one would have guessed that just an hour earlier, she had sat in silence and done nothing. And yet, somewhere between one meeting and the next, her mind drifted back to the car. Not to anything specific, just the feeling, the absence of pressure, the way no one had tried to extract anything from her. It stayed with her longer than it should have. Later that afternoon, her assistant stepped in with her usual efficiency, tablet in hand. "Your car for tonight is confirmed," she said, already scrolling through the schedule. Elizabeth glanced up briefly. Which driver? The question came out before she could filter it, subtle but not subtle enough. Her assistant paused for a fraction of a second, then checked. Daniel Carter. Elizabeth nodded once. That is fine. She returned to her screen as if the answer did not matter. But it did, more than it should have. The evening ride felt different the moment she stepped in. Not because anything had changed, but because she noticed more. The faint scent of coffee, warm but not overpowering. The back seat, clean but lived in, a small jacket folded neatly beside a child car seat in the corner. She had not seen it before, or maybe she had not been paying attention. Daniel adjusted the mirror again, the same subtle movement, careful not to meet her eyes directly. Traffic crawled down Fifth Avenue, headlights stretching into thin lines as the sky dimmed. Elizabeth leaned back, her gaze lingering for a moment on the car seat. It was small, worn in a way that suggested regular use. Not decorative, not for show. She looked away before the thought could fully form. Outside, a siren passed in the distance. Inside, the quiet held. Halfway through the ride, her phone rang. She answered without thinking, her voice shifting instantly into the sharp, controlled tone that built companies and ended negotiations. "No, that is not acceptable. We agreed on terms." There was a pause, then a slight tightening in her jaw. "Then adjust it. I am not repeating myself." She ended the call with a precise tap, the tension returning to her shoulders like it had been waiting just beneath the surface. For a moment, the silence felt different. Thinner. She exhaled, slower this time, her fingers pressing lightly against her temple. Without a word, Daniel reduced the speed of the car just enough to smooth the ride, turning down a side street where the traffic eased, the motion gentler, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it. Elizabeth was. She opened her eyes again, her gaze shifting forward, not quite meeting his in the mirror, but close enough to see the outline of someone who was paying attention without asking permission to. And that, more than anything, unsettled her. Not because it was wrong, but because it was rare, and she was not sure what to do with something that expected nothing in return. The fourth ride did not begin at the curb. It began before she even left her office. Elizabeth stood by the window on the 32nd floor, the city stretching below in a grid of movement and intention, every light representing someone doing something, needing something, asking for something. Her reflection hovered faintly in the glass, composed as always, but there was a pause in her posture that did not belong to the rest of her world. Her assistant spoke from behind her, reviewing the evening schedule, listing names and times and obligations, but Elizabeth only caught fragments. Her mind had already moved ahead, not to the dinner she was expected to attend or the call she would inevitably have to take on the way, but to the quiet space that waited somewhere between here and there. When she finally stepped into the elevator, her phone remained in her hand, but the screen stayed dark. That, too, was new. Outside, the air had cooled, the kind of early evening chill that slipped between buildings and settled into the streets. The car was already there. Same position, same stillness. Daniel stepped out, opening the door with the same measured motion, no rush, no performance. She nodded once as she entered, a gesture so slight it could have been missed if someone was not paying attention. He was. The door closed. The city softened again. This time, she noticed the details sooner. The low hum of the engine, the faint rhythm of tires against pavement, the absence of unnecessary sound. It was not silence exactly. It was control. The car moved into traffic, merging seamlessly as if it belonged there, as if it understood the flow without forcing itself into it. Elizabeth leaned back, her gaze drifting toward the window, watching reflections slide across the glass, buildings folding into one another in layers of light. For a while, nothing happened, and that was exactly what made it different. No interruptions, no demands, no need to perform, just movement. Halfway through the ride, she spoke. The word came out before she fully decided to say it. Do you always take this route? Her voice was steady, but quieter than it had been in any meeting that day. Daniel did not look back immediately. He checked the mirror once, a quick glance, then returned his focus to the road. Not always, ma'am, he said, his tone even, calm, unforced. Only when it is smoother. She absorbed that. Not faster, not shorter, smoother. The distinction lingered in the space between them. She nodded slightly, even though he could not see it clearly. Another few minutes passed. The city shifted outside, traffic thinning as they moved further uptown. Elizabeth's eyes returned to the small car seat again, the fabric worn in places that suggested repetition, routine, care. She hesitated, then asked, "Do you have a child?" The question surprised even her. It crossed a line she usually kept intact, a boundary between roles, between worlds. Daniel answered without hesitation, but without detail. Yes, ma'am. A pause. A son. There was no elaboration, no story offered, just the fact, placed gently into the quiet. Elizabeth considered asking more. How old? What his name was. But she did not. It felt unnecessary. Or maybe it felt like something that should not be rushed. Instead, she shifted her gaze forward, watching the road stretch ahead in a clean, uninterrupted line. Something settled in her chest again, that same unfamiliar presence. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just there. Real. The car slowed slightly as they approached a long stretch of green lights, the motion smooth enough that she barely felt the transition. Daniel's hands remained steady, his movements consistent, like everything he did followed an internal rhythm no one else could hear. Elizabeth realized then that she had stopped thinking about the time. She had not checked her phone once. She had not rehearsed a conversation or replayed a decision. She had simply been there. And for someone who had built her entire life on staying ahead, on controlling every outcome before it happened, that realization should have made her uncomfortable. It did, but not in the way she expected. It did not push her away from the moment. It held her in it. When the car finally turned onto her street, the familiar buildings coming into view, Elizabeth felt it again. That quiet resistance, that hesitation, the kind that did not come from fear, but from knowing that something was about to end before she was ready for it to. And for the first time, she did not pretend otherwise. The car came to a smooth stop in front of her building, the kind of stop that felt intentional, not abrupt, as if even the ending of the ride had been considered in advance. Elizabeth remained still for a moment, her hand resting lightly against the door handle but not pressing it open. Outside, a doorman stepped forward, already anticipating her exit, his posture straight, his attention fixed. Inside, the quiet held for 1 second longer than necessary. That second felt different, not accidental, chosen. She opened the door slowly, stepping out into the evening air, the sounds of the street returning in layers, engines, voices, distant footsteps echoing against concrete. The doorman greeted her, but she only gave a brief nod, her attention not fully there. She turned slightly, just enough to glance back at the car. Daniel had not moved beyond what was required. His hands rested calmly, his gaze forward, already resetting into the role that did not include her once the ride ended. It was clean, defined, professional, and somehow, that made it harder. Elizabeth hesitated, then spoke, her voice measured, almost neutral. Thank you. The words were simple, but they carried more weight than they should have. Daniel met her eyes briefly through the mirror, just a fraction of a second. You are welcome, ma'am. Nothing more. No added tone. No attempt to extend the moment. She nodded once, then turned away, stepping into the building, the glass doors closing behind her with a quiet finality. Inside, everything resumed its rhythm. The lobby lights were bright, the marble floors reflecting movement, conversations already forming around her presence. She walked through it all with the same controlled pace, the same precision that had built her reputation. But something did not reset as easily as it usually did. In the elevator, alone for a brief stretch between floors, Elizabeth let her shoulders drop just slightly, her reflection staring back at her from the mirrored wall. She studied it, not critically, not strategically, but curiously, as if she were trying to understand a version of herself she had not fully met before. By the time the elevator doors opened, the expression was gone. Replaced. Managed. That night, her apartment was quiet in a different way. Not like the car. This silence was larger, emptier, stretching into corners that held no warmth. She placed her keys on the counter, the sound sharper than expected, echoing once before disappearing. Her heels clicked across the hardwood floor, each step precise, but slower than usual. She paused in the kitchen, pouring a glass of water, then standing there without drinking it, her thoughts drifting back again, not to a conversation, not to a specific moment, but to the absence of pressure that had existed in that moving space. She set the glass down untouched. On the couch, her phone lit up with notifications, messages stacked, requests waiting, decisions that would not make themselves. She picked it up, unlocked it, stared at the screen. Then, after a second, she locked it again. That, too, was new. Minutes passed. Maybe more. Elizabeth moved to the window, looking out over the city, the lights now scattered like quiet signals across the dark. Somewhere out there, cars moved through streets. People passed each other without noticing, lives intersecting briefly before continuing on separate paths. She wondered, not for the first time, how something so brief, so ordinary, could leave such a persistent impression. It did not make sense. And yet, it stayed. The next morning came quickly, as it always did, her schedule already filled before she stepped out of bed. Meetings, calls, expectations waiting to be met. She moved through it all with practiced efficiency, her voice steady, her decisions sharp, every part of her functioning exactly as it should. But sometime mid-morning, between one conversation and the next, she opened her calendar and paused. Just for a second. Then, without overthinking it, she adjusted her evening schedule, moving one meeting forward, declining another, creating a space that had not existed before. Her assistant noticed immediately, of course. Is everything all right? Elizabeth did not look up from her screen. Yes, just adjusting timing. The explanation was sufficient. It always was. But this time, the adjustment was not about efficiency. It was about something else. Something quieter. Something she was not ready to name. That afternoon, when the car pulled up again, she did not hesitate before stepping inside. And this time, the silence did not feel unfamiliar at all. The fifth ride did not feel like a decision anymore. It felt like something that had already been decided somewhere beneath her awareness, long before she stepped into the car. Elizabeth closed the door behind her with a softer motion than usual, settling into the seat as if her body already understood what her mind was still trying to define. The city outside moved with its usual urgency, taxis weaving through lanes, pedestrians crossing against signals, horns layering over distant sirens, but inside, the air held its familiar stillness. Daniel adjusted the mirror slightly, the same careful angle, the same unspoken respect for space. This time, she noticed something else. A small paper bag rested in the center console, folded neatly, unremarkable at first glance. She would not have thought twice about it on any other day. The car moved forward, merging into traffic with that same smooth precision, the kind that made every shift feel intentional. Elizabeth leaned back, her eyes drifting toward the window, but not settling there. Her attention moved differently now. Slower, more deliberate. After a few minutes, Daniel reached forward briefly, opening the console just enough to retrieve something, then placing it on the edge of the seat beside her. A simple coffee cup, black lid, no label. He did not turn around, did not announce it, did not explain. It was just there. Elizabeth glanced at it, then at the reflection of him in the glass. Her brow shifted slightly, not confusion, not suspicion, just a quiet question forming. Daniel spoke, his voice calm, measured, as if offering information, not expectation. You mentioned you skipped lunch yesterday, Mayam. Thought this might help. That was it. No elaboration. No insistence. Elizabeth stared at the cup for a moment longer than necessary. She did not remember saying it out loud. Maybe she had. Maybe it had been part of a call, or a passing comment she had not intended anyone to hear. Either way, he had noticed. That realization landed softly, but it did not fade. She reached for the cup slowly, her fingers wrapping around the warmth, the heat grounding in a way she had not expected. It was not about the coffee. It was about the fact that someone had paid attention without being asked to. She took a small sip. It was black, exactly how she drank it. No sugar, no cream. She exhaled quietly, not quite a sigh, but close. Outside, the traffic slowed, a red light stretching the moment longer. Inside, something shifted. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a small adjustment in how the space felt between them. Elizabeth held the cup in both hands now, the warmth steady, her gaze forward. After a moment, she spoke. "You do not have to do that." The words came out softer than intended, less like a correction and more like a boundary she was unsure she wanted to enforce. Daniel nodded once. "Eyes still on the road." "I know." Another pause. Then, after a second, he added, "I wanted to." The simplicity of it removed any argument she might have formed. There was no transaction to reject, no obligation to return, just a choice. That unsettled her more than if he had asked for something in return. Because this existed without leverage. Elizabeth looked down at the cup again, then back up, her expression unreadable even to herself. For years, she had built her world on clear exchanges. Give and take, offer and return, everything measured, everything balanced. But this moment did not fit into that system. It existed outside of it. And for the first time, she did not try to force it into place. The light turned green. The car moved again, the motion smooth, uninterrupted. Elizabeth leaned back slightly, her shoulders lowering just enough to notice. She took another sip, slower this time. The silence returned, but it felt different now. Not just safe, personal, like something had been placed gently into it, and neither of them felt the need to disturb it further. For the rest of the ride, she did not check her phone. She did not think about the next meeting or the next decision. She simply sat there, holding the cup, aware of the quiet in a way she had never allowed herself to be before. And somewhere between one block and the next, she realized something she could not ignore anymore. This was no longer just a ride, and she was no longer just passing through it. The sixth ride began with something missing. Elizabeth noticed at the moment she stepped into the car, even before the door fully closed behind her. The air was the same. The quiet was the same. Daniel's presence, steady and composed, had not changed. But the small paper bag was gone. The console was empty. No coffee waited at the edge of the seat. She did not expect it. Not exactly. But the absence registered immediately, like a detail her mind had already started to account for without her permission. She settled into the seat, smoothing her coat slightly, her movements controlled, familiar. Outside, the late afternoon sun stretched across the buildings, casting long shadows over the street, the city moving with that constant, layered rhythm she had spent years mastering. Inside, the silence returned, but it felt thinner, not uncomfortable, just different. The car pulled into traffic, merging with the same quiet precision. Elizabeth glanced forward, her eyes catching Daniel's reflection briefly in the mirror. He did not speak, did not gesture. Everything remained exactly as it had been before the coffee. And yet, something had shifted. She rested her hands in her lap, her fingers still, her posture composed, but her thoughts moved somewhere just beneath that surface. After a few minutes, she reached for her phone. The screen lit up instantly, messages waiting, notifications stacking, decisions lined up in silent demand. She stared at it for a moment. Then, slowly, she turned the screen off and placed it back down beside her. That choice lingered longer than it should have. The car turned onto a quieter street, the traffic thinning, the motion smoothing out. Elizabeth exhaled softly, her gaze drifting toward the window, watching the city pass in fragments of light and shadow. For a while, neither of them spoke. And then, without planning it, she did. "You did not bring coffee today." The words were neutral on the surface, but they carried something underneath them, something she had not fully examined before letting it out. Daniel glanced at the mirror briefly, then back to the road. "No, ma'am." His tone remained even, unchanged. She waited, expecting something more. An explanation, a reason, but none came. The silence settled again, stretching just enough to feel intentional. Elizabeth shifted slightly in her seat, her brow tightening just a fraction. Why not? The The question followed before she could stop it. It was not sharp, not demanding, just honest. Daniel's hands remained steady on the wheel. Because you said I did not have to. The answer landed simply. No defense, no hesitation, just a reflection of what she had said the day before. Elizabeth blinked once, her gaze dropping briefly to her hands, then lifting again toward the window. That was true. She had said it. And he had listened. Not just heard. Listened. That realization settled deeper than she expected. In her world, people adjusted to her words selectively. They heard what benefited them. They followed what aligned with their own interests. But this was different. He had respected the boundary exactly as she had drawn it. No more. No less. She leaned back slightly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, her breathing slower now. For a moment, she considered correcting it, saying that she had not meant it that way, that it was not necessary to stop. But the words did not come. Instead, she sat with it. The quiet, the absence, the choice. Outside, the city shifted again, the sky dimming just enough to hint at evening. Inside, something else became clear. It was not the coffee she had noticed. It was the intention behind it. And now, the absence carried the same weight. Not neglect, not indifference. Respect. Daniel turned onto her street, the car slowing smoothly as it approached the curb. Elizabeth remained still, her thoughts settling into a place she could not easily define. When the car stopped, she did not move right away. Her hand rested against the door handle again, but she did not open it. Instead, she spoke, her voice quieter than before. You remembered. Daniel did not turn fully, but his eyes met hers briefly in the mirror. Yes, ma'am. That was all. Elizabeth nodded once, her gaze steady now, something shifting behind it, something softer, more deliberate. She opened the door and stepped out, the evening air meeting her again. But this time, the silence she carried with her did not feel like something she had borrowed. Interruption anymore. It felt like a continuation of something neither of them had named, but both had quietly agreed to protect. Elizabeth stepped into the car without hesitation, her movements fluid, familiar, as if the space inside had already adjusted to her presence before she arrived. The door closed with a soft click, sealing out the noise of the street, and for a brief second, she allowed her eyes to close. Not fully, just enough to register the shift. When she opened them again, the city was already moving past the window, the rhythm outside steady, predictable, almost distant. Inside, the quiet held. But this time, it did not feel like something she was borrowing. It felt like something she belonged to. About the way he said it. Not defensive, not apologetic, just careful, as if the world required that kind of separation, even when it should not have. The car slowed at a light, the glow from the intersection casting a warm reflection across the interior. Distance. Something steadier. Something that did not need to be explained to exist. The eighth ride began with rain. Not heavy, not loud, just a steady rhythm against the windshield, soft enough to blend into the background, but constant enough to change the shape of everything outside. The city looked different through it. Lights blurred. Movement slowed. Edges softened. Elizabeth stepped into the car, brushing a few drops from her coat, her hair slightly damp at the edges, her posture still composed, but carrying something quieter beneath it. The door closed, and the sound of the rain shifted from distant noise to a muted presence surrounding them. Daniel adjusted the wipers to a slow, even pace, the motion steady, predictable, almost calming. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The rain filled the silence in a way that did not feel intrusive. It belonged there. Elizabeth leaned back, her gaze drifting toward the window, watching the city pass in streaks of light and shadow. She noticed how different everything felt when it was not sharp, not rushed, not demanding clarity at every second. It reminded her of something she had not thought about in years, something softer, less defined. Halfway through the ride, her phone rang. The sound cut through the quiet more sharply than it should have, pulling her back into the world she knew too well. She glanced at the screen, her expression tightening just slightly before she answered. Her voice shifted immediately, controlled, precise, every word measured. No, that is not the direction we agreed on. Might ease the space around her. Then, without a word, he turned onto a side street, one that was longer, less crowded, the traffic slower, the movement steadier. It was not a shortcut. It was not faster, but it was smoother. Elizabeth noticed. Of course she did. Her eyes shifted forward, catching his reflection briefly in the glass. There was no question in her expression this time. No confusion, just recognition. He was doing it again. Adjusting without asking. Responding without making it visible. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, the tension easing in a way that surprised her. After a moment, she spoke, her voice quieter now, less guarded. You always know when to do that. It was not exactly a question. Daniel's response came after a brief pause, his tone even, unforced. Not always. Just when it matters. The words settled into the space between them, carried by the soft rhythm of the rain. Elizabeth looked down briefly, her fingers resting lightly against her coat, then back up again. Something shifted behind her eyes, something she did not try to hide this time. For years, she had been the one who controlled the environment, who dictated the pace, who adjusted the world around her to maintain balance. Not ask what she meant. He did not need to. He simply nodded once, his eyes steady, his presence unchanged. And in that small acknowledgement, something unspoken became understood. The ninth ride did not begin with movement. It began with waiting. The car was already there, parked along the curb, engine running, steady and quiet, as if it had been there longer than necessary, as if time inside it followed a different set of rules. Elizabeth stepped out of the building, her pace slower than usual, her eyes lifting briefly before she reached the door. She noticed him before he noticed her. Or maybe he already had. It was hard to tell with Daniel. He existed in that space between awareness and stillness, present without drawing attention to it. He stepped out, opening the door with the same measured motion, but there was something different this time. Not in the action of the street, the motion smooth, almost unnoticed. Elizabeth leaned back slightly, her shoulders lowering in a way that no longer felt unfamiliar. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence was no longer something that needed to be protected. It was something that existed on its own. Then, after a few blocks, she spoke again. Not because she needed to, because she chose to. Why do you do this? The question was simple, but it carried more weight than anything she had asked before. Not about the route, not about the car, about him. Daniel considered it for a moment, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze forward. Because it matters, he said finally, his voice calm. Even. People think it is just a ride. A point from here to there. But it is not. There was a pause. Then, softer, it is the space in between. Elizabeth closed her eyes briefly, the words settling somewhere deeper than she expected. The space in between. She repeated it quietly, almost to herself. For years, she had lived in the endpoints. The meetings. The results. The outcomes. Always moving toward something. Always leaving something else behind. But this had been different. This had been the part she never accounted for. The part she never measured. And yet, it had changed something in her she could not ignore anymore. The car slowed as they approached her building, the familiar curb coming into view. But this time, Elizabeth did not reach for the door. Not immediately. She sat there, her hands resting loosely, her gaze forward, the quiet surrounding her not as an escape, but as something she carried within her now. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady, but softer than it had ever been in any boardroom, any negotiation, any space where she had once defined herself. Daniel. He met her eyes in the mirror, just for a second. Yes, ma'am. She held that moment.